Yeah, I was having some issues getting on. There we go.
We all did.
Yeah, I don't feel like the only one then.
Wait, are you at Crater Lake?
Okay, sorry about that, Dylan. I'm ready for a countdown. Sounds like we're having a couple of back and forth issues here. Let me try and. Okay, we're live, Dan.
Okay, good evening, and thank you for viewing the September 8th meeting of the Arcata Planning Commission. The Planning Commission meeting is being held as a webinar in response to local efforts to reduce the spread of the COVID-19 virus. I want to start by thanking the community and visitors to Arcata and the county for their efforts to slow the spread of COVID-19. We are leading by doing. We are masking up to protect each other and the most vulnerable in our community, and practicing social distance. These two fundamental acts of social responsibility will help flatten the curve, keep ourselves and neighbors healthy, and keep our businesses open, not to mention supporting frontline essential workers that serve us daily. If you wish to make public comment during the meeting, either at the two open public comment periods or for an individual agenda item, there are two ways to do so. Number one, if you are logged on to the Zoom meeting webinar, click on raise your hand on the right-hand side of your screen. When it is time for public comment on the item on which you wish to speak, the clerk will unmute you. You will have 2 minutes to comment. Or number two, you can access the meeting by phone. Call the number at the bottom of the screen. Enter meeting ID also at the bottom of the screen. Press *9 on your phone. This will raise your hand. When it is time for public comment on the item on which you wish to speak, the clerk will unmute your phone. You will hear a prompt that will indicate your phone is unmuted. You will have 2 minutes to comment. And number three, you may also submit written comment via email addressed to pc@cityofarcata.org. Your email will be forwarded to the Planning Commission, but commissioners may not receive your comments before deliberating or rendering a decision if the decision is made the day of your comment. And now we will begin the meeting. I'd like to call it to order. Can we begin with a roll call, please?
Yes, Commissioner Davies.
Here.
Commissioner Vasade-Elcock.
Here.
Commissioner Barstow.
Here.
Commissioner White.
Here.
Commissioner Figueroa.
Here.
Vice Chair Mayor.
Here.
And Chair Tagney.
Here. Oral communications are next. Director Loya, do we have any public comment that should be read before we start?
I am going to allow the attendees a moment to raise their hands if they have oral communications. Seeing none.
Seeing none, we will move on to our consent calendar. All matters on the consent calendar are considered routine and are enacted in a single motion without separate discussion. If a commissioner or member of the public wishes to discuss an item, that item may be removed from the consent calendar. Do any commissioners wish to remove an item? Is there a member of the public that wishes to remove an item?
I believe that this consent calendar, or this agenda, we did not have a consent calendar item. We did not get the agenda, the minutes on for consent.
Okay, so we have no items on our consent calendar. And we can move on to item number 4. We can move to item number 5 right away, public hearings of which we have none. So now we're on to business items. And the first business item of the evening is the All Points Design Review Minor Modification.
Okay, good evening, commissioners. Wanted to present this to you tonight. The as a to try and get some feedback from the commission on the potential minor modification that staff is considering for the project that was approved just last meeting. The all point sign master sign approval had some recommendations from staff. As I outlined in our staff report for tonight's meeting, some of those recommendations unfortunately were made without reference to the Business and Professions Code. And then in addition, we received some feedback from the Humboldt County Department of Weights and Measures, who had some, I wouldn't say strong concerns, but certainly some concern about having slightly larger signage than the city had approved. And so typically when a permit is approved, design review permit or otherwise is approved, the Planning Commission makes their approval. We go through an appeal process, or the appeal period. The permit is active once the applicant starts acting on it. Oftentimes we'll get into a situation where on the ground, the situation is slightly different than we understood at the beginning when we permitted it in the first place. And so we always include this minor modifications condition of approval, which allows the director to change slightly the approval of the Planning Commission without any further due process to accommodate those unknown and unknowable circumstances at the time of approval. Typically, these are made with, administratively without any kind of report back. But this time, because the changes that are being proposed here run contrary to some of the specific findings that the commission made, I decided that before moving forward with the minor modifications on this, that I'd report back and sort of ask for the commission's blessing. So this is not a formal action item. I'm not asking you to take a motion. I'm not asking you to make any kind of formal approval. Instead, what I'm asking for is you to review what I'm proposing as approvable as a director's determination for a minor amendment to the existing approved project, which appeal period ends tomorrow, and tell me if you concur. If you concur, then I'll make that minor modification call and the permit will be so modified. If you do not concur as a body, if you feel like there are some of those conditions that we're proposing to change that you feel strongly about that you want to retain in the approved project, I am not going to contradict that will of the Planning Commission, and instead I will allow the applicants to avail themselves of the appeal process if they so choose. So just outlining, it's in your staff report, but I just want to highlight the major changes to what the approval process was. The conditions that the Planning Commission levied were that the sign height should be, and I'm talking about just the marquee sign here, the sign height should be reduced to 10 feet, eliminate the word gasoline from the sign and leave a gap, reduce the lettering to 4 inches tall, reduce the price numerals to 6 inches tall, and retain the gap at the bottom of the sign. If you look onto packet page 6, the bulleted items there in that list show you what the proposed change is. This is what I'm referring to as the minor modification, is that we retain the word gasoline on the sign. That's actually required by Business and Professions Code, and we cannot condition the sign such that it doesn't have that word on it. Eliminate the gap in the sign where the word gasoline was proposed. So the word gasoline is going back in instead of asking them to readjust the sign where we had originally thought there was going to be a gap because there was going to be no signage there. I'm not proposing that we then create another gap. It'll just make the sign overall larger, number one. And number two, once the applicant's agent described to me the construction method for these signs, they sort of link together like Legos. And so you can't have a gap in them. Otherwise they won't meet the structural standards that are required for the sign company. Retain the product lettering at a maximum of 5 inches tall. They had originally requested 5 inches. We settled on 4 as a intermediate between the 2 that staff had recommended, which again, Weights and Measures said that they did not think that was large enough for public health and safety reasons. And so they've already got these blocks that include that 5-inch lettering. Again, this is not a finding. This is not something that weighs into the commission's deliberations, but if you did allow them to retain the 5-inch tall lettering, I believe they could redo the, using some of the existing sign parts, they could redo the existing numerals. And then reducing the price numerals to 8 inches tall instead of 6 inches tall. And again, that was primarily on the basis of the recommendation from the weights and measures, who believe in their professional opinion that 6 inches is too small, recognizing that people are looking at those price signs, even if there's not a direct competitor across the street, they're looking at them as they're slowing down and deciding whether to pull in or not. And so those are the changes. All the rest of the commission's approval is remaining the same, but those are the changes that we're recommending for a modification, as this minor modification process is allowed by the condition of approval that you approved last week. And so I'd just like your insights on that, whether you want to do it by straw poll, if you want to have a little bit of deliberation, discussion, and then indicate to me whether you would concur with that decision or not. It's up to you.
Thank you, David. Are there any commissioners that have any direct responses that they want to throw out on this one? Judy?
Commissioner Mayer and Commissioner Barstow both have their hands raised.
Yeah, I really appreciate that the Department of Agriculture and Weights Measures, Mr. Hoffman weighed in on this. And obviously, anything that is required by law certainly is something that it's clear that we can't get rid of the word gasoline. If there's a price next to gasoline, we need to know that's what it is. As far as the size of the lettering goes, you know, if there is a size of lettering that is also required by law, I guess we have to go with that. But I think that the visibility issues here are perhaps different than the standard that one would usually imagine of people driving by a gas station. There is no one driving by this gas station without also stopping at those stop signs. And so I think that our recommendations about lettering size were based on that in a residential neighborhood where nobody should be driving anywhere near this at more than 25 miles an hour. And anyone considering pulling into the gas station is also stopping at a stop sign first. So I think we need to trust our sense of visibility for this particular sign. And unless it's required by law, I think that our recommendations on lettering size should stand.
Commissioner Barstow also had his hand raised.
Judith makes a good point about the nature of the traffic there at a four-way stop. The 6-inch letters would be perfectly, or numbers would be perfectly fine, in my opinion. I did a little internet research and discovered that the sign people have a rule of thumb about optimum visibility of letter size. And the rule of thumb is that you multiply the inch size by 10, and then that's how many feet away is the optimum for visibility. So for a 6-inch sign, it's 60 feet. But also, the same source said that a 6-inch letter is visible and readable from 200 feet away. So really, a 6-inchers would work fine in this application. However, I checked out the sign on the Union Station down the street on Alliance, and their numbers, unfortunately, I didn't have a measuring tape with me, but roughly are bigger, taller than 6 inches, a little bit less than 8 inches. So as a matter of equity, I think, and being fair, I think we should let them go with the 8-inch size. Otherwise, I'm fine with the other provisions here. Interestingly, the state code allows minimum size on the word gasoline of 1/3 the height of the numbers. So I don't know how big a, I think well, I think that the mantra of sign makers is when in doubt, make it bigger. So I don't know what they're going to do. And the same thing with the 5-inch tall product lettering, which could be a lot smaller and still be legible. And I think, there's a built-in conundrum about signs. You only need a sign the first time you go to a place. And the second time you go, you know where it is, usually. And in this particular situation, the gas station is not pulling people in off of 101. It's a neighborhood gas station, and people who pass by there know about it. In fact, I've stopped there many times. But anyway, so basically, I'm okay with the suggested changes.
Commissioner Davies has his hand up. Sorry, you're muted. Try one more time. There you go.
I just wanted to echo what Vice Chair Mayer said, and I think that the smaller size of those is completely fine, especially given the stop sign there. Just wanted to concur with her observations.
No other comments? So David, would you feel best if we at least did some kind of a straw poll on this?
I think so. I think Commissioner Mayer, Vice Chair Mayer had her hand up, and then there's also the applicant and their agent who may want to address the commission.
Great, thank you.
This is a question that doesn't have to do with the marquee sign, but with the canopy sign. And I noticed that the graphic in the material that we had last week didn't have the Patriot logo and the big sign on it. But when I went by the site on Friday, only 3 days after our meeting, the canopy sign with the big Patriot on it, as in this proposal, was already up there. And so I'm just wondering about that, since it was part of the proposal, and if it was already there beforehand, the signage, the existing signage in our packet was misrepresented. And I know that maybe should come after a little straw poll here, but it is part of this big question of at what point the city's decision is a decision.
The agent may want to address the timing of when the canopy signage went up. Certainly, if the commission makes a decision, there's an appeal period, and it would be the owner's risk if they installed something that was ultimately appealed and then disapproved. But perhaps the agent can address the timing. Commissioner Barstow looks like has one more item to add.
Yeah, actually, I think what Judith is suggesting was that the signage was pre-existing. but it isn't. It wasn't the whole fascia of the canopy was replaced and made bigger. So I think they did what we approved. I haven't been by there recently, but I think there's no question about it.
Perhaps the agent can address that when they speak.
Can I?
Commissioner Mayor, Vice Chair Mayor.
Yeah, it appears to be what we approved, but that approval doesn't become effective until, I believe, 10 days after the approval, and this was only 3 days after the approval. And so maybe some clarification from the city about what exactly our approval means would be helpful.
Would you like me to address that now, or shall I address it after the?
How about just a real quick clarification, David, if that's all right?
May require some discussions and deliberations. I would suggest that we go ahead and finish the item.
Okay, then are we ready for the applicant, or are there any other commissioner comments or questions at this point? You don't see any hands raised, do you, David?
I do not. So
Okay.
I'm going to bring in the applicant's agent. Okay, Larry, you're unmuted and able to speak.
Thank you. My name's Larry Wallace. I work for Valley Pacific Petroleum. We are the owners of the Patriot brand. And I just wanted to clarify something about the signage itself. The signage is in the corner of the lot, which is typically considered to be the visual triangle area. And from a business perspective, it's the worst possible place the sign can be. We'll be the first to tell you that. However, with this site, as small as it is, there is no alternative site for the ID sign to meet weights and measures requirement, and that's addressing both the primary and secondary street. So you'd have to have one on Shear Avenue including one on Alliance. So on Alliance, the only spot, because of the sidewalk and the property line, would be maybe at the southeast corner of the property. However, the curb cut is too close to it. On Shear Avenue, there is no other spot to put the sign because the sidewalk comes right up to the tank slab. You have the curb cut and then you have the tank slab. So you can't go into the tank slab and obviously can't go into the sidewalk. So when the sign was installed originally, it was put out there at a 45-degree angle. That 45-degree angle allows visibility from all four sectors of that intersection. And it kind of compromises the straight-on look of a sign. If you go by all of your signs in town, including Giantoli Lane, you go downtown, the signs are typically all squared up to the street. They're perpendicular to the street so that you can see them head on and you can see them clearly for a longer distance. This one is at a 45-degree angle because the site is compromised because of the size. And you're talking about 6-inch letters being visible at the stop sign. The reason that the sign is not good in a visual triangle is because there are so many other things going on in a visual triangle at a stop sign. There could be pedestrians crossing the street. There are 3 different directions that you have to make sure that nobody's coming from. So your whole attention is your defensive driving skills. And you're not looking at a price sign or a product sign. You're looking at it about 100 feet before you get to it to make your decision to turn in or not. By the time you get to the stop sign, it's already gone. It's already out of your vision. It's out of your thoughts. Your thoughts are all on that triangle, or I'm sorry, at that corner, at that intersection, how you're going to maneuver through the intersection. So weights and measures does have an allowance, a minimum sign size of 6 inches. But those 6 inches are typically for secondary signs on a secondary street, or if somebody is using cash credit pricing and they put their lower price on the big sign, they have to have another sign that defines what the highest prices are, and those are typically hidden off to the side, whatever. And so to not deceive the public, weights and measures requires them to be a minimum of 6 inches, but that's their very minimum. On this particular intersection, a minimum of 6 inches out there on the lighted price sign, I think is putting them at a very competitive disadvantage. And because of all of the things that I just explained to you, and the distance before you get to the station, the angle of the sign that is compromised from all 4 directions, a 12-inch would be preferred from us. But I understand that you don't want that. You have other stations in town that have 12-inch letters, numerals, but I understand what you're trying to bring your sign ordinance or code into compliance everywhere. We're only asking to go 2 inches taller to an 8-inch that we believe will work in this. But that's really what our challenge is allowing the customers to see it far before they get to that busy intersection. And it is the busiest stop intersection in the city. And they're not just residential customers that come through there. There are a lot of people that commute through that way, going to the college or going to businesses and things like that. Granted, they come that path frequently, but prices change all the time, and the product label has to be clearly identified what that product is that's associated with the price that they're looking at. So we ask you to take it into consideration under those conditions. And those are also, I supplied a letter from Weights and Measures who also feel the same way and highly recommend that. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Larry. Anything else, or are you complete there?
Oh, sorry, I'm muting him.
Sounded like he was done. We can move on. So at most, you're looking for a straw poll just to get a recommendation from us. Are there other comments from the commission, deliberations before we do a straw poll?
Chair, if I may, it appears that Ms. Toasty would also like to speak.
Who is that, David? Sorry.
Ms. Toasty, the applicant.
Okay.
Okay, you're live.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for looking at this minor adjustments to our sign. Of course, they are minor adjustments, and I think that they would be highly welcomed by all of us and the community and the neighborhood. As Mr. Wallace mentioned, it is a very busy intersection. It is a 4-way stop, and we do have 2 entrances to enter the property. So our customers can make a decision before even reaching the stop sign. So I think it would be important to have enough visibility and having a substantial letter size or numeral size so people can make that decision. The other thing as well is there are pedestrians, and for public safety, I think that if clients or customers could make that decision before reaching the stop sign so they're not distracted, could be beneficial for everyone in the neighborhood. Now, this really is the last thing we have to do. We're in the home stretch. So if it is really an ensemble, isn't it? This whole project. It's not just the pumps and the canopy, but there's the sign, there's the branding. This is really marketing 101, right? People are constantly driving back and forth on Spear Avenue, on Alliance, everywhere, searching for, differences in gas prices. So we're just asking that you consider these minor modifications that we would highly appreciate and would really help us to strive and be a successful business in the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, commission comments before straw poll?
Like Commissioner White has a comment.
I just wanted to say that I drive down Spear all the time, and there's a food truck there that's distracting. There's a bus stop right there. And although school right now is in distance learning, once we get back to whatever that new normal looks like, we have kids, pedestrians. It's a really busy Four Corners there. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Anybody else?
Me, hi. I really feel like if the applicant really feels like having her numbers in her letters just a few inches bigger, if that's going to make the difference between them being successful, really in this time, right? I feel like this should not be the mountain we die on. I feel like we should just let it go. If they really feel like this is going to make their business more successful. That's my opinion.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Can somebody identify how this straw poll should, what the question is, which way we're voting?
I would suggest that since there are multiple facets to the minor modification, that if anyone has a feeling that they could approve some but not all of those bulleted items, that you indicate now, in which case you might want to go through the bulleted items one by one and take a straw poll on each of them. Otherwise, if everyone feels like they could vote uniformly in a block on all those items, then you could just have a straw poll question that is, does the commission concur with the minor modifications recommendation of the director?
Okay, let's try that first. Does the commission concur with the minor modifications that the staff is supporting on this? And we'll have to do, I don't know, we could do a hand raise, right? Because this isn't that's enough for you, right, David?
That works, yeah.
Okay, so if you concur with the staff's minor modifications, please indicate by raising your hand.
Okay, so I had 4 affirmative, and Davies and Mayor negative. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what I'm seeing. Okay. Is that enough information on that? Can we move on?
I think so.
Okay. Our second business item of the evening, pardon me, is the local coastal program progress update and public review.
Okay, good evening again, commissioners. On the agenda tonight is sort of the first sort of soft rollout, if you will, of public engagement on our local coastal program update. I put into the staff report super high level local coastal program 101 is what I called it. Essentially, for the newer commissioners, just wanted to give some background on that. I'm not going to cover that in the staff report today, unless there are questions on that. Obviously, the city has been engaged in its local coastal program update since 2000. So this has been a long-running project for the city of Arcata. It's had many false starts, and it's had a range of different levels of collaboration and coordination with the Coastal Commission staff over time, as well as lots of changes in the philosophy and underlying organization that the city is proposing. Many of the study sessions, planning commission reports, city council reports that formed the current version of local and the structure that I'm going to present to you tonight happened over the last several years. And some of you did not have access to those meetings, and for that I apologize. Part of the reason I'm bringing this to you is to bring out to the open, to the commissioners, to the public in general, what that proposed structure is. And now that we have a framework in terms of a chapter to actually look at that, I wanted to walk through some of the highlights of the chapter just to describe how we would facilitate this new zoning ordinance overall. I know certain commissioners were very anxious to start seeing what the local coastal program looked like, and we are still currently working on it. Right now, the city has its second coastal commission grant to do this work, and I believe this will be hopefully the one that brings us to fruition. We've been working with coastal commission staff, both in our local office and the state office. We've been reviewing administrative drafts of the land use plan, the sort of policy level document, and this implementation plan or the zoning ordinance. And much of the body of work right now is just, it's not in a state that is shareable with the community. But this planning and locating development really gives the architecture, the underpinnings, if you will, of how we regulate the development in the coastal zone. And so that's why I wanted to share that part with you. So I'm just going to kind of walk through page by page the way that it's laid out, starting from packet page 9 if you wanted to follow along. And I'll describe sort of the highlights. Obviously not going to get into detail, but if you have detailed questions, please feel free to ask. First, I want to point to table 12.2-1. And I'll note that these chapter headings may change, so don't get attached to them, please. This is just for the purposes of this internal review document, and we'll have to see how it meshes in with the rest of our zoning ordinance. But I wanted to point out to you that in this table 12.2-1, all of the different zoning districts that are identified in the coastal zone are identified as overlay zones. You're familiar with overlay zones from the land use code, where we may have a base zone district, such as, let's say, industrial limited. And then it has certain overlay zones that allow for differences in the zoning type. And so it may have, for instance, a historic overlay. If it was an industrial property, had a historic building on it, we adopted a landmark on that property, there would be an overlay zone indicating that. Now, our overlay zones are a little bit varied in the types. Some confer land use. Some confer information about, restrictions on titles, such as, wetlands. But the purpose of adopting overlay zones, instead of just changing the underlying base zoning, stems to the condition that we're in right now. Right now, we have the CLUDGI, the Coastal Land Use and Development Guide. Folks internally call that the CLUDGI, the acronym for it. But the coastal zoning ordinance was adopted in '89, and our land use code was adopted in 2008, excuse me. Lost a decade there for a moment. And so decades separate these two documents. Decades separate the philosophy, the ideas, the zoning types. And so as a result, we have a fissure right down the coastal zone boundary. On one side of it, you have a completely different zoning ordinance than you do on the other side of it. In recognition of this, many years ago, the city adopted the land use code citywide, which clarified slightly, because it at least meant that those underlying zoning districts, everywhere you go in the city, they all mean the same thing. The added complication is that now we have the coastal zoning still, the CLUDGI, in the coastal zone. And so when we're trying to approve projects or review a land use activity for its consistency, we have to use both these zoning ordinances, and there's a lot of overlap. The Venn diagram is huge in terms of the overlap between these two documents, and it causes a lot of frustration for decision makers, applicants, and staff. You recall recently the discussion we had on the Redwood Coast Montessori project, where the zoning is totally misclassified. They just have completely different zoning types. One with a completely allowed permissible use, principally permitted. One with a use that ostensibly isn't allowed at all. And so Those are presented challenges for the community. Our solution to this is to make an overlay zone, just like we have everywhere else in the city, that tells you what are the specific requirements that are necessary to address coastal issues, coastal dependent issues, coastal permit issues. And then all of the other standards, all of the other zoning requirements, the uses, all of those other principles are left to the land use code. This is a significant departure from, as far as I understand, any other community in the state of California in the way that they regulate their coastal zoning. But it significantly simplifies coastal development permitting and coastal zoning in general. Essentially, what it allows the city to do is to maintain its underlying zoning that does not have an impact on coastal dependent uses, coastal issues, and layers all of that into one ordinance that regulates those issues. So when an applicant comes in and they say, well, what's my zoning? We would tell them if they're in a residential very low density property in the city's land use code, we tell them that they have a residential very low density property with a residential very low coastal overlay. Letting them know, yes, you're in the coastal zone, there may be additional restrictions, but for the general types of issues that you would have questions about land use zoning, it's the same citywide, whether you're on one side or the other of the coastal zone boundary. So this is an important hallmark of our coastal zoning ordinance, and I wanted to take a moment and see, are there any questions, or does that raise any challenges for you? And to remind you that this wasn't something we just are springing on you now. This came from prior discussions with the council and the planning commission.
Commission questions?
Commissioner White.
So this is new for me, and I just want to make sure I understand. So an overlay is combining both the land use and the coastal codes. And so coastal codes would always supersede, is that correct?
Yeah, so to put a little finer point on it, let's say that the residential low density zoning district has a 20-foot setback, front yard setback. That 20-foot front yard setback is in the land use code. We would ask ourselves, before deciding to put that 20-foot front yard setback into the coastal zoning ordinance, will it impact a coastal resource? And if the answer is no, it's not going to show up in that ordinance at all. The answer is yes, it's going to be in both places because we may need to regulate it in both places. But the combining zone overlays on top of the underlying zoning being regulated by the land use code, and the overlying zoning having only to do with those coastal resources.
Excellent explanation. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, we can come back to those two if there are additional questions. You'll see through the organization on pages 10 and 11, packet page 10 and 11, that we have descriptions of what the what those zoning overlays are, and they're going to match real closely with what the underlying zoning is, the basic purpose for them. But I want to draw your attention to under section 2.12.040, the allowed land uses, and specifically the allowed uses on the table on packet page 12. In our land use code, you would see a table like this, and it would tell you whether or not it's principally permitted, requires a use permit, or requires a minor use permit, what the permitting type is for that given land use. Our land use code also goes into very fine granular detail about use types. What we're doing with the coastal zoning ordinance is, because its sole purpose is to define and describe the regulations associated with coastal resources and how you review a coastal development permit. All this land use table tells you is whether or not the use is principally permitted, and then thereby, if it's in a categorical exclusion area, you don't require a coastal development permit, or if it requires a coastal development permit, regardless of whether you're in the categorical exclusion area or not. We can get into the detail about the categorical exclusion area if you want to, but the major difference that I want you to focus in on and to understand here is that this ordinance, the whole purpose of it is to tell you, do you need a coastal development permit or not? So instead of telling you anything else about that use type, instead of going into any of the information about how a use permit, what the process is for issuing that use permit, who needs to be noticed, what the commission, whether it goes to the commission or the director, all of that is left to the land use code. We've already got rules on that. Why should we duplicate them? Instead, we tell you how to issue a coastal development permit in here. And so this use table, all it tells you is whether you need a coastal development permit or not. So that's slight deviation from the way that we've seen it before in other coastal zoning ordinances. Wanted to make sure that folks had a handle on that and are still on board with that approach. Okay, looks like everybody understands those. Getting into packet page 15, we start to see some of the standards that we believe the Coastal Commission is going to require in order for them to say, yes, we understand you're regulating development sufficiently to address the Coastal Act with this land use zoning ordinance. And so we do go into the types of standards that are that planners use to regulate the density and intensity of use on these lands. We talk about the maximum site coverage, how tall buildings can be, how much lot area can be developed, or what the minimum lot area is required there. Talk about density, residential density. We do get into the floor area ratios, how bulky, how massive a building can be. And then we get into setbacks here. But as you go through this zoning ordinance, you'll find that there's relatively few standards. We don't go into huge detail about parking, for example. There's a little bit of detail about parking, but not gross detail like we have in the land use code. None of that's overlapped or reduplicated. So this is the general structure. This chapter right here kind of sets us up for how the rest of the document is going to look. I didn't give you the table of contents. We'll start looking at that in our next commission meetings, but each of the other chapters within the zoning ordinance are going to address real specifically the types of resources that are impacted in the coastal zone related to development. We'll have sections on, special habitats, ESHA they're called, environmentally sensitive habitat areas. We'll have chapters on general development in cover things like parking, the number of number of bike stalls required, so on and so forth. So all of those specific resource area chapters will be coming shortly to you, but those fall under this general premise, so that when we're issuing a coastal development permit, we look to those. And then to answer, I think, the more specific question that Commissioner White asked earlier, what's the relative weighting between these two ordinances? If it turns out that we have something in the coastal zoning ordinance that is more stringent than something in the land use code, if you're in the coastal zone, we would still continue to use that standard. So I just wanted to open it up for a discussion and also to provide, if there's not a lot of discussion about the general overall format, wanted to provide a little bit of insight into what our public outreach is going to look like over the course of the next couple of months.
Commission questions?
Commissioner White.
So this may be a topic for another meeting, but at what point will there be engagement with regards to climate change and the various modifications that would happen as a result of that? So I don't know. That's my question.
Yeah, we've had several, excuse me. We've had several public engagements to date. We've had everything from, The King Tide walks, we've scheduled events over the past several years to have people come out and observe king tides, using it as a learning moment to talk about sea level rise. We've also held several planning commission study sessions where we've invited the public to come to those. But we still have a lot of engagement to do on this topic. And right now it's challenging to do public engagement. A lot of it is done on a platform such as this, which is challenging for some folks who don't have access to those resources. When we get through this part, I'd like to discuss a little bit about what our plans are for that, but we are intending to continue to do outreach and engagement specifically around climate change. There'll be a whole chapter on sea level rise in the coastal zoning ordinance. Okay, I'm not seeing any others. So I guess I will segue to the outreach and engagement. Not much was put into the staff report on this, and a lot of this we are still trying to develop. The city of Arcata has been privileged to work with the Institute of Local Government as one of its boost communities over the past 18 months. And largely what we focused on is the long range planning public engagement. A lot of our public engagement design was tailored before COVID. And so we're finding ourselves now having to pivot and learn new ways of obtaining the same level of in-depth engagement. And in particular for the city's priorities were around traditionally marginalized folks that didn't get to a public hearing such as this one. So we had a lot of strategies that were focused around meeting folks where they were at. We went out to the community where either at the farmers market or the crabs games, but we also went to Winco. We went to Friday night market. We went to soccer games that were held in McKinleyville. We held bilingual translated Spanish meetings, town hall meetings, and did a lot of other activities that were intended to try and engage folks who either aren't comfortable or fluent in English, aren't comfortable coming to public meetings, or just don't have the time to. And so right now we're looking at some of those pivots will go back to more of a traditional model. We're looking at using the mail. Now, oftentimes, if you get something in the mail, if you happen to go and check it that week, and you see it's from the government and it's not a bill, you toss it. So we recognize it represents a challenge to try and solicit input through the mail. We're talking about doing some short snippets on YouTube and then using some tools, some paid tools to try and advertise those out to make sure that we don't just rely on the folks that are already coming to our website to like those and translate those into more views, but actually use some of the tools that are available to us to boost that message. We're also considering if we can plan for COVID safe practices, having some outdoor public engagement. In particular, I'd like to ensure that we get into some of the lower income housing, market rate housing that is in the coastal zone that would be affected by these policy changes that over time, because of climate change, may mean that we're removing these the buildings that these people live in. How do they feel about that? How is it going to affect them? What does it mean for their livelihoods? What is the city's plan for transitioning? Where else are we going to build if we're going to lose housing and economic options out in these vulnerable areas? All of those questions, we need to have those discussions with the community, and we need to have those discussions real broadly within the community. My experience to date with those discussions is that we have large groups of folks come to our King Tide events that are very interested in birds and plants and the environment. They have backgrounds in science. They're well educated. They have enough money to take the time out of the day to come to our meeting and tell us all about it. That's certainly an important perspective. But folks who are living in these lower income zones that are potentially vulnerable to sea level rise in the future, we got to make sure and ask them to how these policies affect them. So we're strategizing. One of the great things that the Institute of Local Government and the Boost program has been working with us on is to ensure that these ideals that we have about inclusivity and making sure that we're bringing everyone to the table to have the discussion. Not necessarily that everyone at the table is going to get what they'd like, but they're at least going to be heard. Their points are going to be discussed and understood, and they'll have an opportunity to share that with the city. But making sure that we're doing that with all elements of long-range planning, including climate change, and not just focusing on, what the few folks that can come out to those king tide events will tell us. So we do have, speaking of public engagement, we actually have one person who's in attendance who's had his hand up for quite some time. So I wanted to let the chair know that, as you can't see the hands on your side. But certainly open to either allowing the public to comment at this point or deliberations or discussion of the Planning Commission.
I'm up for listening to the public right now. What do you guys think? Is that yeah.
Okay, Colin, I've brought you into the meeting. If you'll please unmute yourself and address the commission.
Thank you, David. Can you hear me?
Barely. If you could speak more directly into your microphone, that would be helpful.
Okay, I will try to speak a little louder. This is Colin Fisk. I'm with the Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities. And wanted to say, first of all, that I really appreciate what David was just talking about with the efforts to do, outreach to marginalized communities. I think that's really, really critical. And I appreciate that the city is putting effort into that, and also appreciate that it is particularly challenging in these times that we're in right now. I wanted to make a couple of comments about the draft language that was just being discussed regarding the parking. I just wanted to express the sort of perspective that the current language is basically that off-street parking is provided to the extent necessary to ensure that the development doesn't have adverse public access impacts to the coast. I understand that's an issue of concern in the coastal zone and for the Coastal Commission. But I wanted to present the perspective also that excessive off-street parking can also present an adverse impact to public access to the coast for people who are not driving a car, by its impact on the density of development, and as well as the design of the street and so forth. So I think it would be nice to incorporate sort of that that perspective also into the principles for parking. I realize they're not going to get into a lot of detail, but the principles that we're looking at. And then my final comment actually is more of a question. So relating to how future changes to the underlying zoning and the coastal overlays will be handled. I think both as a result of what was described earlier, the effects of sea level rise, and that there are likely going to need to be changes to the underlying zoning and land uses for some of these parcels, as well as in the areas that are closer into downtown. Perhaps personally I would like to see more of the more of the mixed use and denser development in that area, and how we'll be able to when the underlying zoning changes, how will that affect the overlay zone? Will they will they all be changed at the same time? It seems like there may be required to be text amendments. Anyway, seems like it might complicate the rezoning process, and I was hoping someone could speak to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Is there anybody else, David?
That's it.
Okay, back to commission comments or questions. I'll jump in. David, one of the things that I like to think is as this part of our code evolves, I'd like to think that the local coastal plan and how it plays out in our community becomes more intuitive. And part of what I'm basing that on is that I've been on the Planning Commission for quite a while, and I've been a little confused about the edges of the coastal zone, for one, and they seem rather arbitrary. And that, it seems very intuitive to not let any projects block access to the coast, and to have some environmental layers about surface runoff and all those things that would in fact impact our sensitive coastal habitat. But there's many other parts of this that I don't quite understand why they're part of a coastal plan. And for example, on page 16, where it says to approve the CDP, the review authority must make all of the following findings. And at least three of the items on that list of 7 seem like they would be citywide. The modification will be compatible with adjacent structures. I mean, some of these things just seem so like, why is that part of the coastal, specifically the coastal plan in it? And that's what I mean by it being a little less intuitive than I wish it were. I know that's a very broad comment, but it's part of what I've always struggled with. I just don't quite get. I mean, I get the closer we get to the bay, the more likely we're in the coastal zone, but most people in Arcata, short of city staff, don't have any idea that it goes up to 7th Street and some kind of random neighborhood lines that I think you've indicated were rather arbitrarily placed when they were created. So anything that moves it towards a more of a document that people can identify as what is the end goal here, besides just some kind of random bureaucratic stuff. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Short of that, I'm really glad you're streamlining, and I get the bigger picture reason that you're pointing that you have different overlays with different requirements, and it's very confusing. I totally acknowledge that. Anybody else?
Commissioner Mayer and Commissioner White both have their hand up. If you want to, just go ahead and jump in round robin style, and let's forget the blue hands for a while.
Is it okay if I speak? Okay. First, I'm really glad that you're sharing this update with us at this point, because it's a huge job. It's been going on for a very long time, and seeing progress toward actually getting the new local coastal program is exciting. Most of what is in here today is the draft of the basic framework for land use, basically zoning. I'm wondering if you could share with us some of the other chapters that will be included in the local coastal program, because it's way more than just zoning and land use, obviously. So, obviously the zoning and land use code that will be necessary for approval of coastal development permits, that's a big part of it. But, we have a lot of infrastructure, we have a lot of decisions to make about public safety, tsunamis, sea level rise. So if you have an outline of, what the other chapters would be, that would be terrific. And, some of us are pretty familiar with the Coastal Act, so we might have a clue and have looked at the old 1989 program. I think most of us probably don't. So any idea of the rest of the chapters and sections that we'll be addressing?
Would you like me to tell you now, or bring them to another meeting?
I think another meeting is probably the way to go. But seeing it sort of chapter by chapter, I'm really happy to see, this initial one, but understanding how they all fit together is going to be really interesting as well. Thanks.
So I had a question or maybe a comment, if this is a good time with regards to public engagement. I'm wondering if maybe a possible consideration would be to use, there's an app called the Nextdoor, and you can strategically address particular neighborhoods so that those particular communities that will be directly affected more than others, you can make sure that they're included in the conversation. And then, and I'm sure that you guys are going to use social media, but my thoughts were that there's particular Facebook pages that are specific to certain Arcata communities as well. So just some more ideas. And then my other question would be, will Heather Equinox be involved in as we roll this out, even though the engagement process is going to look quite different during COVID?
So thank you for the recommendations. We'll definitely look into those. Online platforms in general is what we're kind of left with as options. I think in particular for folks that have there's a digital divide, is bottom line, and so we're looking to bridge that gap and make sure that we can reach out to folks who don't have the resources to access Nextdoor or Facebook. But those are really good recommendations, and we'll definitely look into them as part of one of the tools in our tool belt. And in terms of Heather, we do have her under contract for public engagement. We haven't quite determined how we're going to use that contract given the current setting. So more on that. We'll be developing that over the coming month or so.
Thank you.
Anybody else going to jump in? David, you're not looking for any action on this, just a little response, and this is just the beginning of a long process. We should expect more in the future, right?
Absolutely, and this, I have to admit the decision to put this on your agenda tonight was, kind of done in haste. It was a little last minute, and so we'll be doing more outreach. That's why I call this a soft entry to our engagement. We'll be doing more outreach, making sure that folks like Colin, other folks that have expressed an interest in coastal planning have early notification and are able to participate a little more fully. But yes, this will be the first of many. If you want to, I can address your two questions really briefly, Chair Tedney. So the boundary is not intuitive. This update, while it's comprehensive, is not looking at amending the boundary. That's an entirely separate process from adopting the local coastal program, which is focused more on implementing the Coastal Act within that boundary. Boundary changes are a lot more difficult than even a comprehensive update. But we'll certainly look to clean up boundaries where we can, but probably not in this process. Does add to the confusion. Why is my neighbor across the street, not subject to these regulations, but I am? Is the common confusion that comes with that. In terms of the overlap, you pointed to one of the findings. It seems like a no-brainer. It's a finding. It should just be in the land use code. There are a certain number of requirements that are going to be necessary in order to get certified as a local coastal program. And so there's going to be some overlap. And I think that you pointed out was a really good point. We probably have that exact same finding or something very similar to it in the land use code. But the Coastal Commission, if you were to say, well, we've got that in the land use code, don't worry about it. We don't need it in the coastal books. They would say, well, if you're going to use it to regulate a coastal development permit, it has to be in this LCP. So do you want us to certify the land use code? We say, no, we don't want to do that. So what the situation that we're in right now is there's almost 100% overlap between the Venn diagram circles of the land use code and the coastal land use and development code. Almost every requirement is reiterated in some way, shape, or form between those two documents. We're trying to pull that Venn diagram apart and leave just a tiny little sliver of overlap between these two documents, only the most necessary sliver possible, so that it minimizes that confusion. And so, you know, we're doing our best, and really that source of confusion was one of the acorns for this idea of creating a coastal zoning ordinance that really does create less overlap. And then just real quick on the parking, I think that's a really good point that Colin made. Mr. Fisk made the point that parking should not affect non-motorized users. I think I got that clear. And I'll have a side conversation with CRTTP and make sure that we've got good participation with them. But I think that's a worthwhile consideration to put in, because the Coastal Act is concerned with making sure that there's access to all user groups. In particular, they appreciate providing for lower income visitors. And so that's a low cost way to get around this by bike. So we'll look at adding something to that effect.
Is that it, David, with this item?
Yeah, unless there are other comments or questions from the commissioner, I believe the staff report is complete.
Okay, anybody on that? Seeing none, we'll move on to correspondence and communications. Anybody have anything?
I see no commissioners with correspondence.
And David?
I don't think that staff has any correspondence or communications at this point.
Okay.
Also.
All right. I guess my only small question would be if I like to think that everybody worked through the little glitches of getting into this webinar. It was a little different. It required an email input, and Judy talked me into it. So I guess if we just all get on a little bit earlier next month or next meeting, we can hopefully get through easier. Nothing else, we can adjourn. Thank you.